court as a hostile forum, and so it went. The court judgment was never even reported, and it was radically violated. Okay, that's the World Court. This goes back much further. Back in 1962, Dean Acheson, highly respected statesman, senior advisor of the Kennedy administration, informed the American Society for International Law that a situation in which our country's power, position, and prestige are involved cannot be treated as a legal issue. Okay. He was referring to the U.S. embargo against Cuba, which of course he recognized was illegal, but nothing in which our power, position, and prestige are involved can be treated as a legal issue. And accordingly, at that time, you heard Adlai Stevenson at the United Nations defending the U.S. attack against South Vietnam as defense against internal aggression. The South Vietnamese were carrying out internal aggression in South Vietnam, and we were defending South Vietnam against them. We were defending South Vietnam against what John F. Kennedy called the assault from within. That was when he launched the assault from without. This goes way back. In earlier years, it had been in secret. So in earlier years, the flat rejection of the charter is explicit, very explicit, but in secret. It goes back to 1947, first memorandum of the National Security Council, in which it called for national mobilization in the United States, support for military action, paramilitary action, other such things in Italy, if the communists took power by legal means in an election. In other words, if a democratic election came out the wrong way, we would use force to overthrow it. That's 1947, NSC 1. Story goes on from there. The innovation in the Reagan years was that the contempt for international law became completely overt. It wasn't even secret anymore. Under Clinton, it's lost any pretense. So the conclusion is, the only reasonable conclusion is that the first pillar of world order, the international political order, has totally disappeared. It's available as a weapon against enemies, but nothing else remains except the theological dogma that we uphold world order international law. That remains, independently of the facts. So nothing else remains. Well, let's proceed. Turn to the Universal Declaration, second pillar of world order. This is a tightly integrated document. It has conventionally divided into three parts: civil and political rights, socioeconomic rights, and what are called solidarity rights. The integration of all of those was stressed from the beginning. You look at the background, it's clear, repeatedly been stressed since. Time's short, so I won't run through the history. The major law review article that just appeared on the 50th anniversary by Harvard law professor Mary Ann Glendon stresses that the Universal Declaration elevates social, economic, and cultural rights to fundamental right status, and that is a crucial part of the universalization of rights carried out in the Universal Declaration. In short, there is no place for any sort of relativist demand that certain rights must be relegated to secondary status in accord with, say, Asian values or some other pretext. Glendon also points out quite accurately the support for that was very broad-based at the time. You have to remember the time. This is right at the end of the Second World War. There were values of that kind, the kind expressed in the UD, were deeply entrenched in the anti-fascist popular forces in Europe and in the colonial world and even in the United States. That was deeply disturbing to U.S. elites who intended to create a very different kind of world order, and indeed were quite explicit about it. But the dogma remains, and it proclaims a more self-congratulatory version. Well, there were some who did dismiss the Universal Declaration as meaningless. So there's an often quoted phrase of Andrei Vyshinsky's, the Russian delegate whose record doesn't have to detain us. He dismissed the Universal Declaration as a collection of pious phrases. And it was dismissed as, quoting, a letter to Santa Claus by Jeane Kirkpatrick, Reagan's UN ambassador, who was deriding the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. Moving on couple of years, it is an empty vessel, a dangerous incitement, preposterous. That's Morris Abram, UN ambassador to the UN Commission on Human Rights. He's explaining Washington's rejection of what was called the right to development, which, if you look at it, is a very close paraphrase of the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration that was vetoed by the United States alone, essentially vetoing the socioeconomic provisions of the UD. The U.S. also radically violates the civil and political provisions. I won't go through the details, but quite clear and not surprising. One of the latest major Amnesty International reports is about this. In brief, two pillars of world order have been effectively demolished, except as ideological weapons. That doesn't mean that the people of the world shouldn't defend them. They do remain ideals that people should try to defend, that they should fight for, and that they should also transcend, because they're not the end of the road by any means. But to take that stand in the United States, you have to first carry out an act of intellectual liberation. You have to free yourselves from the doctrines of the faith. You don't do that, you can't even enter into the fray. First have to free yourselves from the doctrines of the faith and at least be willing to subject them to empirical verification. If they're not even subject to empirical verification, there's no point discussing these matters, clearly. If they are, you can ask whether this analysis is correct or some different analysis is correct. Well, that's a radical, just the willingness to subject them to examination, the doctrines, that's a radical departure from prevailing norms, including everything in the educational system and academic scholarship and the media and everywhere else. So it's not small. Well, a couple of words about the third pillar, the Bretton Woods system. One of its central, which again was tightly integrated with the others, and that's worth understanding. A central component of the Bretton Woods system was regulation of finance. And there were several reasons for this. One reason was that it was an effort, it was understood that deregulation of finance would harm the global economy. There are good reasons for that, and they've been illustrated in recent years. The trouble is that financial markets, as was understood, are quite volatile and unpredictable. To quote a couple of MIT economists, specialists on this, financial markets are governed by panics, manias, and crashes. They swing far above and below any kind of sensible fundamental values, creating bubbles that will burst. Paul Samuelson, who says the evidence for that is overwhelming, and this was understood back in the 40s. So you deregulate financial markets, you're going to have a disaster, and it'll harm the general economy. That was one reason. A second reason was closely related to world order and human rights. One reason for both capital controls and keeping currencies within a narrow band was that that it was understood that deregulation of capital is a tremendous weapon against democracy and social and socioeconomic rights. Before mentioning that, let me just say that the current debate between the United States and its G7 partners is over keeping currencies within a narrow band. If you read the articles on this, you notice that the U.S., the G7 position, Germany, Japan, France, and so on, is maybe not Britain, but the other G7 countries, is that currently major currencies should be kept sort of closely interconnected, not too volatile. And that was rejected as crazy by U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin, because if we were to agree to that, it would mean that some other authority might determine that we're not allowed to lower interest rates to stimulate the economy if we want to. So if the economy is sinking into recession, we won't be able to allow interest rates because that'll affect currency values, and it would be crazy to allow any other country to allow us, to any international organization, to prevent us from carrying out those fiscal policies. Exactly the fiscal policies that we force on every other country, as the very same articles point out, without any sense of contradiction. Take a look and think about it. Why is deregulation of finance a weapon against democracy and human rights? Well, very obviously. And it was understood. The reason is that if capital flow is unregulated, it will quickly create what some international economists call a virtual Senate, a Senate consisting of concentrated international financial capital, which will simply impose decisions on government by the threat of capital flight. So if some government pursues irrational policies, so policies that are aimed at helping the population, let's say, instead of raising profits for investors, and are therefore irrational, like education or health or environmental policies or whatever it may be, you can force them to stop simply by pulling all the capital out of the country, which sends the country, forces interest rates up, sends the country to depression, the usual consequences. So therefore, unless capital is controlled, you've very sharply restricted democracy and human rights. Well, that was understood then, and it is understood now. The Bretton Woods system with financial regulation persisted through roughly 1970. That's a period that's commonly called the golden age of post-war capitalism, a period of high growth of productivity, expansion of the social contract, so-called welfare state, which turned the Universal Declaration into something a little more than a letter to Santa Claus. From the early 1970s, that system was dismantled. First at the initiative of the United States, Britain came along, later others, other major economies not until the 80s, and the results wouldn't have surprised the founders of the Bretton Woods system. The results have transferred, well, some economists call it a transfer from a golden age to a leaden age. In the period since, there has been a slowdown of the economy globally, and the social contract has been dissolved dramatically in the U.S. and Britain, to some extent elsewhere. Inequality's gone way up. Consequences I have already described briefly. One region of the world temporarily escaped from this. That's East Asia, which is quite different from Southeast Asia. There was, well, quote the chief economist of the World Bank, there was an unprecedented economic miracle, which was based on the fact that they disregarded the religion, as he calls it, the religion that markets know best, and they disregarded the prescriptions of the international financial institutions, the so-called Washington Consensus, and they carried out an unprecedented economic miracle. In the early 1990s, South Korea liberalized capital flow under very heavy U.S. pressure, I should say, one of several factors. That's a large factor in the subsequent collapse. That's generally agreed. Up till 1997 or 1998, the global economic system was considered really great. It was, in fact, what's called an economic miracle, fairy tale. Very much the way Mexico was an economic miracle during the period when the number of billionaires was rising about as fast as the poverty level. There was no crisis until 1997-98. All there was anguish and fear, insecurity about jobs, and a life of quiet desperation, quote the head of UNCTAD. But that's not a crisis. That's a miracle. Because that was only outside the doors, remember. Inside, the festive atmosphere was exuberant. But by 1998, the festive atmosphere inside was becoming a little disturbed. The interests of rich people were being affected. So we moved from economic miracle to crisis. Those are technical terms. Again, it doesn't have much to do with what's happening to the people. It has to do a lot with what's happening to rich people, rich, powerful people. And their interests were starting to be disturbed, so all of a sudden we had a crisis, as distinct from anguish and fear and so on. Well, that crisis is now all over the front pages, so I won't waste any time on it, though it's interesting. One side effect of the crisis is that all of the certainties have dissolved. So the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, which is, the most conservative and respectable institution that exists. It's called the Central Bank of Central Bankers. In their latest report last summer, they said nobody has a clue as to what's going on, and they urged that we have humility. Instead of issuing confident pronouncements. Let's at least have enough humility to